very much, Andrew, and apologies in advance for anybody who's hoping to see Yasmin come following Jemima. I'm stepping in for Yasmin, who is worn out as a result of her efforts over the last 2 weeks in a very good cause, which I want to plug before I start, and that is the single Freedom for Palestine, which I'm hoping many, many people in this room have already heard. Fantastic single, put together by Faithless, Dave Randall from Faithless and the others, the Durban Community Gospel Choir, London Community Gospel Choir. In the last 10 days, 250,000 people in just 10 days have seen this on YouTube. We need everybody to pre-order it so that we can get it into the BBC charts. You've got one of these leaflets on every single seat. There's more on the PSC stall, the War on Want stall, and the Stop the War stall at the back. It made Glenn Beck, the presenter of Fox News, cry on air, so it must be good. But I'm really pleased to be here and talking in my own right in respect of this 10th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan and the War on Terror. War on Want has actually been looking back over a 60-year anniversary this year as well. It's 60 years since War on Want was founded back in 1951, when Britain was mired in another unwinnable war in Asia, this time in Korea. And for those of you with even longer memories, you'll know that that war led to 3 million civilian deaths, an absolute outrage, which sparked our movement. And War on Want has always been a movement focused on the both elements of imperialism, the economic, but also the military. And that's why we're really, really pleased to be able to join in this conference today and to support the Stop the War Coalition and to commend them for keeping that flame alive. Andrew spoke at the beginning about the 2003 marches, where I'm sure all of us, with millions of others across the world, joined in an attempt to stop the Iraq War. We didn't stop the Iraq War, but we sent a really clear message that this would not be tolerated in our name, and as Andrew said, we stopped many other things from going ahead. But we have slid back. We've slid back into a situation today where there's an almost unwritten acceptance of casual imperialism. Casual imperialism on the British and NATO side, which allows us to continue with the war in Afghanistan, which allows us to bomb Libya without even the slightest hint of a mandate from the United Nations which would actually allow for the things that we're doing, and allows us to continue supporting the same imperialist regimes across the world, whether it be in Israel or other countries of the Middle East, with impunity. And that, for me, is where we need to focus our efforts in building this movement and taking it forward now. Because we've got a situation now where it's as if there's 3 camps in Britain. On the one hand, you've got the politicians and the generals who take us into every new military adventure. You've got the people of Britain who are by and large against the wars. Again, Andrew mentioned it, 70% of people in Britain, in poll after poll, 70% want troops out of Afghanistan, either immediately or soon. 70% on a regular basis. And again in Libya, we've seen people are not behind our bombing. So you've got the politicians saying yes, you've got the people saying no, but you've got the media creating a propaganda smokescreen which actually prevents any honest discussion of this issue in Britain. And that's really one of the things I think we've got to focus on today. The idea is that Britain and NATO forces are going around the world doing the right thing, trying to bring justice and democracy, and they're doing it in really hard circumstances, and yes, it's an uphill struggle. But the reality of what's going on in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, in Libya, is completely denied us. And I think that's one of our chief aims, our chief responsibilities in this movement, is to break that wall of silence. And that's why for War on Want, we this year wanted to go back, almost in parallel of the work we did 60 years ago on Korea. We wanted to bring out this report on Afghanistan to try to bring the reality of the occupation home to people in this country, There are copies of this over on the War on Want stall. Please take at least one each. We don't want to take any back to the office. Please make sure that they all go home to you and read it, because it was our attempt really to break through that silence and to bring to the people's attention exactly what's going on in Afghanistan. And Jemima talked about the reasons for being in Afghanistan. And yes, we know the official reasons which have been given year after year. But actually, if you look behind those headlines, there are a lot of other reasons which have been put forward in slightly more private conferences and seminars by our government leaders. And they have nothing to do with the war on terror or defending us from the Taliban or bringing human rights to the Afghan people. They're all about the geostrategic interests of this country and other NATO countries in the region. Afghanistan stands in the middle of Central Asia, neighbouring Iran. It's crucial in terms of the geostrategic interests in that region. It's also crucial in terms of mineral resources. You may have seen that the US has found up to $1 trillion of mineral deposits, copper and others, in Afghanistan. The pipeline, which they need to go from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan to Pakistan and India, absolutely central to the war reasons. So all of the guff about human rights, democracy and defending us is actually for public consumption only, and we've tried to bring out the reasons for that behind. But actually, the real scandal about Afghanistan is what it's doing to the Afghan people. 10 years of NATO occupation, on top of 10 years of civil war, on top of a further 10 years of Soviet occupation and rule. That has brought the Afghan people to their knees. Life expectancy in Afghanistan today is 44 years. It's the lowest of any country in the world. Afghanistan has the highest infant mortality rate of any country in the world. We are taking it backwards towards a past of the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries. And the escalation of the war is bringing more and more instability. So why on earth should the Afghan people be made to wait another 5 years of more surges, more military instability, more escalation of violence? And Jemima talked about the drone attacks in the tribal areas which are expanding the war into Afghanistan, from Afghanistan into Pakistan as well. She said pretty much there needs to be said about that, but the US commanders themselves have noted that they've managed to kill 14 Al-Qaeda leaders, 14, through these drone attacks. And with the same drone attacks have killed 700 civilians. That's the official figures, 14 Al-Qaeda leaders for 700 civilians in collateral damage. But the thing which really gets me is that we are now using these same drones in Libya for the bombing of Libya, and, what's worse, the BBC is putting out that this is in order to make more precise our bombing of the targets in Libya. Philip Alston is the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. And he said that the US and UK use of drones in Afghanistan and Pakistan is a crime against humanity. It is breaking international humanitarian law because these are indiscriminate weapons. You cannot target like that. And yet the BBC, with absolutely no backing or justification, feels it's happy to go out and say that these are precise bombing instruments. And that throws us back. Do you remember 20 years ago when there was the first Gulf War? Do you remember the BBC used to roll every evening with the Pentagon briefings showing you the precision bombing? Do you remember that? And they were always saying, it's actually great. This is no longer the sort of carpet bombing of Dresden or Hamburg or Coventry. It's now precision bombing. Until they actually realised that the precision bombing had incinerated 300 women and children who were hiding in a bunker, and they had to sort of shut up with that. 10 years later, they came back in it again in 2003 with the bombing of Iraq. It's okay. These missiles are precision and guided. And again, they had to drop that. Again, they come back. Now, we have to stand up and say enough of these lies from the BBC. This is not precision bombing. This is indiscriminate bombing with massive civilian casualties. And I think also the other thing we need to be able to lay out in front of people is that it's not just our brave boys and girls who are going over to these countries There is a completely other element to these wars, and that is the privatization of our wars. The increased use of mercenary groups, mercenary companies, these private armies, which you can now buy stocks and shares in on the London Stock Exchange if you want, a sort of almost like gentrified version of the mercenaries, the dogs of war of old. They're now operating not just in Iraq, not just in Afghanistan, but in Libya as well. You may have seen the Al Jazeera report, which actually revealed that we already have British mercenary groups working in Libya and very probably in the pay of the UK or its allies. We need to break this wall of silence. And if you think that there isn't a wall of silence, I was just 2 weeks ago at a launch of the World Bank's new World Development Report. And this year, the World Development Report of the World Bank has got as its theme violence, war, and the cost of conflict around the world. Which you think to yourself, hey, well, that's rather good, actually. It's nice that people are beginning to wake up to the fact that militarism has these consequences. And the guy who was presenting the World Bank's report went through all of the different types of conflict that they dealt with, the types of violence. And they dealt with political violence, they dealt with ethnic violence, they dealt with civil strife, they dealt with criminal violence, like the big gang wars in Mexico, which have killed tens of thousands of people. And then he stopped. And there was this silence in the air, saying, well, haven't you actually forgotten something? The state violence, the military adventures of NATO, this massive, massive loss of life over the last 10, 20, 30 years as a result of these. And he said, yes, well, we did, of course, think of that, but being the World Bank, we didn't put it into the report. And the fact that that is permissible is one of the things that we need to challenge. So my final words are this. We need to build the movement to expose the reality of war, to expose what it means for people across the world, and to expose the fact that NATO is not a benign force. That Britain is not a benign force in these countries trying to bring human rights and democracy. We are in these countries for our own nefarious interests, and that needs to be brought out. The good news, as far as I see it, is that we are winning the battle in certain quarters. And particularly for those of us who work within the trade union movements, there's very good news that both Unite and Unison, as well as supporting the call for troops out of Afghanistan, very quickly passed their own resolutions calling for an end to the bombing of Libya. And that is good news because these are the two largest unions in the country, and we need to be able to build that force to come behind the anti-war movement. We need to challenge casual imperialism. We need to expose the reality of war. And finally, we need to join our voices with the forces of resistance across the Middle East, across Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Western Sahara, Palestine. We need to stand in solidarity with these brave people who are taking on a much, much tougher fight than we have to fight here. But I'm sure that if we can read